Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating piece of source material, a prominent long-form YouTube lecture by an Islamic scholar. Our goal here is to impartially unpack the actual architecture of this specific defense of faith against modern atheism. For those outside the Muslim faith, this provides a really insightful window into exactly how contemporary Islamic apologetics structure their arguments logically to address a secular world. Okay, let's dive into this.
To truly understand this, we're taking an analyst's breakdown approach, walking step by step through the speaker's rhetorical journey. We'll cover a 5-part agenda. First, the shift in Islamic teaching. Second, 3 proofs of a creator. Third, challenging chance and nature. Fourth, critiquing evolutionary theory. And finally, 10 proofs of revelation.
All right, part 1, the shift in Islamic teaching. The lecture actually kicks off with a pretty fascinating historical observation. The speaker points out that proving God's existence, well, that wasn't actually the original focus of early Islamic teaching at all. And why is that? Because historically speaking, atheism was just incredibly rare. Even the earliest adversaries of the faith didn't deny a creator, they just worshipped different intermediaries. Outright denial of a higher power was considered almost irrational in the ancient world. But obviously, times have changed. The speaker identifies 2 primary types of modern atheism that contemporary scholars have to address today. The first is just the complete denial of any creator. The second is essentially deism, people who acknowledge that, sure, a creator exists, but they completely deny any organized religion or divine laws. They believe God basically created the universe and then just walked away. You've probably bumped into both of these perspectives in your own conversations or online debates. The entire lecture we're looking at is meticulously structured to answer both of these exact groups, in order. Moving right along to part 2, 3 proofs of a creator. Having set up that modern problem, the speaker transitions into his core philosophical arguments. He moves from the historical context right into his logical solutions to address that first group, the people who deny a creator entirely. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the speaker structures his defense into 3 distinct pillars. He isn't just relying on vague spiritual feelings, he actually categorizes the evidence. First up is the internal compass, known as fitra. Second is external logic, or intellect. And third is sensory evidence, which points to documented miracles and the universal phenomenon of answered prayers. To really unpack that intellect and reason argument, the speaker shares a super vivid analogy from a simple, ancient Bedouin proverb. The footprint indicates the walker. The logic here is incredibly direct, right? If you see a footprint in the sand, you instantly know someone walked there. If you see a building, you know for sure there was a builder. Therefore, the speaker argues, the profound, staggering complexity of the universe absolutely demands a creator. He says it literally violates basic human intellect to assume a design of this magnitude exists without a designer. So what about that internal compass, fitra? To explain this innate human disposition, the speaker turns to history's most famous atheists. He claims that moments of extreme distress reveal an inescapable human instinct to seek out a higher power. He actually cites the harrowing deathbeds of figures like the French philosopher Voltaire or the Soviet leader Stalin, arguing that when all worldly power fades away, that internal repressed need for a creator violently surfaces.
All right, part 3, challenging chance and nature.
Once he establishes why he believes a creator is necessary, the speaker moves into the next phase of his argument. Here, he actively attempts to dismantle secular, non-religious explanations for the origin of the universe. First up, he tackles the concept of chance. And he uses highly visual, almost humorous analogies here to argue that the mathematical perfection of the universe just cannot be a random accident. He says believing the universe formed by chance is like believing a room full of monkeys could randomly type out a literary masterpiece, or that kids wildly splashing buckets of paint could somehow perfectly decorate a luxury apartment, or that a brick could just decide to up and jump through a window on its own. So, if the universe is way too complex for random chance, could what we call nature be the creator? The speaker completely anticipates this counter-argument and pivots to critique nature as a secular substitute for God. He approaches this by essentially setting a philosophical trap. He asks, what actually is nature? Well, it has to be one of 2 things. It's either physical objects, trees, mountains, rain, which are themselves created and therefore cannot be the ultimate creator. Or nature refers to the invisible laws of physics, but laws, he argues, inherently require a lawmaker. He asserts that attributing creation to nature merely answers how the universe mechanically works, but completely fails to answer who authored the system in the very first place.
It's a really compelling distinction between the how and the who that honestly often gets blurred in modern debates. Next up, Section 4, Critiquing Evolutionary Theory. This brings us to a major pivot in the lecture. Having addressed chance in nature, the speaker transitions into a highly contentious rejection of secular science, specifically targeting evolutionary biology. Now, we are impartially reporting the speaker's stance here, which is completely unambiguous. He argues that Darwinian evolution is a foolish theory that fundamentally lacks observational proof. He asserts that if evolution were true, we would see species actively transitioning today, like monkeys turning into humans right before our eyes. Because we don't see that, and because he claims modern genetics contradicts it, he rejects the theory entirely. But his critique goes way beyond just biology. It's deeply ideological. He argues that evolutionary theory is dangerous because it replaces an absolute moral law with the concept of survival of the fittest. According to the speaker, when a society believes that raw power and survival are the only natural laws, it completely justifies horrific behavior. He claims this exact philosophy was the driving force behind the historical atrocities committed by leaders like Stalin and Mao. At this point in the lecture, the speaker basically considers his first target, the complete atheist, fully answered, so he resets the narrative arc for the final act. Now he's addressing that second group we talked about, the deist, the person who says, okay, sure, I believe a creator exists, but why should I follow a specific organized religion, and specifically, why the Quran? Which brings us to Section 5. 10 Proofs of Revelation. This leads into the final rapid-fire section of the lecture. The speaker's goal here is to definitively prove the divine origin of the Islamic text. He shifts gears from philosophical arguments about the universe to historical arguments about scripture. He anchors the audience's attention by promising exactly 10 specific logical proofs. He wants to demonstrate that the Prophet Muhammad could not possibly have authored the Quran himself, meaning it absolutely must be divine. Let's rapidly fire through the first half of his proofs. Number 1, the text contains incredibly accurate historical prophecies, like successfully predicting a Roman military victory. 2, the well-documented historical illiteracy of Muhammad, which he argues makes it impossible for him to write a complex literary masterpiece. 3, a stark, undeniable linguistic contrast between the highly poetic Arabic of the Quran and Muhammad's regular, everyday speech. 4, the fact that he consistently refused to take any personal credit for the book. And 5, the text focuses heavily on theology rather than celebrating his own military or political victories. If he wrote it himself, the speaker argues he would have totally made himself the hero of the story. Now let's look at the remaining proofs, and this brilliantly illustrates the internal logic of his defense. Number 6, the immense personal sacrifices he endured just for sharing this message. 7, the surprising absence of his own family's milestones in the text itself. 8, the inclusion of verses that actually reprimand the prophet himself for his mistakes. I mean, why would an author publicly scold himself, right? 9, revelations were often delayed during major crises when he desperately needed them to save face. And finally, 10, the text maintains perfectly unchanging principles throughout his entire life, never once bending to political convenience. So by the end of the lecture, that overarching logical thread is pulled completely tight. The speaker concludes that by first establishing the absolute necessity of a creator through intellect and nature, and then systematically proving the text could not be human-made, the audience is logically compelled to acknowledge the Quran as divine revelation. His defense against both the atheist and the deist is now totally complete. Which leaves us with a final, really provocative thought. Regardless of your own personal beliefs, does analyzing the architecture of a religious argument like this change how you view the boundary between faith and logic? It is genuinely fascinating to see how meticulously structured these modern theological defenses are when you really break them down. Thank you so much for exploring this analyst breakdown with us, and as always, keep exploring and keep asking questions.